Yo, what's going on, guys? It's Anton here, and welcome back to the last video. I think this is episode 13. We're going to be talking, well, this is going to be the last topic that's going to pretty much close up the whole entire Intro to Programming course. We've covered a lot, really, so if you've gone this far and you've learned a lot since then, definitely give yourself a pat on the back because, not everyone can go through all of these videos and get this far and really like learn all of these things. So I'm hoping that if you've gone to this point, you've gone through every single other video, you have a better understanding, or even if you're a recurring viewer of programming itself, right? If you're just trying to get back into programming, you know give yourself a pat on the back. Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about arrays. Okay, it's going to be like a little bit it's kind of like we're diving into the whole data structures territory, but don't worry about it. Okay, we're gonna make this very, very simple. Alright? So arrays are actually used pretty much everywhere. You're gonna use arrays all the time. Okay, there's no way of avoiding them. And all arrays are, they're just a data structure that can hold a collection of elements. That's it. We've dealt with variables that can only hold one single particular value. Right? I'm pretty sure at some point you've probably thought to yourself, I wonder if variables can hold multiple values. And well, we've kind of discovered something like that. We've discovered objects, right? Objects are, pretty much a data type that can be assigned to a variable, and objects can hold different types of values, right? But objects are more used for kind of like describing an entity, right? You'd use arrays to group together a collection of data that is like all the same, right? Like all the same data types or data groups, if that makes sense. Okay, so yeah, that's all arrays are. You can, it's just a data structure that can hold multiple different amounts of data. That's it. Okay, and arrays are indexed, and what that means is that each element stored has a unique index in which we can reference to access that particular element. So their indices are numeric, so precisely by integers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Arrays are zero indexed, and what that means is that they start at 0. And they're also dynamic. In JavaScript, arrays are dynamic, so you can always add as many elements as you want in an array at any time in the program. Alright? And then just to also, in contrast, in other languages, arrays are not dynamic. You have to specify a size for that array before you can actually use it. Okay? Cool. So before we go over a couple examples, let's just say, why arrays, right? Like, why would you ever want to use arrays? Like, why would you need it? And it's pretty obvious because they're capable of holding, a numerous amount of elements. Declaring 100 variables to store 100 different numbers isn't quite ideal. It can be troublesome. You might lose track. And arrays pretty much solve that issue. Let's say you wanted a list of 100 numbers, or let's say you wanted a list of names. Let's say you wanted a list of all the people that bought from your store. You'd probably want to store those names inside an array, those strings inside an array. Okay, it's perfect for grouping together related data, such as a group of people's ages, or their ethnicities, or their favorite foods, or etc. Okay? So let's actually go ahead and look at some examples. Okay, so arrays are enclosed with square brackets. So and every single element is separated by a comma. So on over here, line 2, this is what an array would look like. Okay, so well, at least in JavaScript. In other languages too, they are a little bit different. But I'm trying my best to kind of like compare and contrast here and there. But don't worry so much about other languages though, just focus on JavaScript for now. So let's go ahead and create a file called array.js, and we're going to create our very first array. So I'm going to go ahead and declare a variable, and I'm going to go ahead and say let names, and we're going to specify square brackets. Okay. We have used square brackets before to reference properties and objects, but we use square brackets to create array values. So right now this array is actually empty, and if we log this array to the console, you're going to see that when we execute this, it's going to print out just the square brackets. That basically means it's an empty array. If you want to get the size of the array, like the total amount of elements in the array, you could use the .length property, and you can see it says 0. There's nothing in the array. Okay, cool. Alright, so let's actually add some stuff to the array. We can do it in many different ways. during initialization, you can actually specify the values of the array beforehand. So if I want to go ahead and say, you know, Anson, Kelvin, Jake, Ryan, Samantha, what else? Sarah, etc., right? I can specify as many names as I want. And if I log this to the console, it's going to pretty much log all of those names. And you can see it's separated by commas. We have Anson, Kelvin, Jake, Ryan, Samantha, Sarah. And the length of this array, or the size of the array, is 6. And pretty much the length of the array are the total amount of elements in that array. Okay? Cool. So another thing that I should mention as well is that even if you have like values like undefined or null, these are still considered elements in the array. So if we were to log this to the console, you would see that it would get printed out, right? And the length of that would be, I think, what is it, 8? Yeah, it's 8. Just like that. So that's just one thing I want to mention. So some people think that just because you have these null values, these undefined values, it means that it doesn't have anything to do with like the size of the array. It does. Okay, they're still considered elements. Okay. Another thing that I should mention is that arrays don't, the values, the elements inside the arrays don't all have to be the same data type. So I can have an array of mixed data types. So I can have, you know, numbers in here. I can have Boolean values. I can have objects in here. I can even have functions in here. So let's just create a simple function. This is a no-named function, anonymous function, and you can see that the size is 11. If I log names to the console, we have an array of a bunch of different values. We have strings, we have numbers, we have Boolean values, we even have objects, and we have a function as well. That's pretty cool. Obviously, try your best to avoid, you know, mixing things up, like mixing up data types with your arrays. If you need to have some kind of collection of the data types that like collection of different data types, it's best to probably use an object, and if that's the case. Okay, and yeah, arrays are dynamic, kind of like how objects are. Arrays are objects. Okay, now arrays are dynamic, and what this means is that we can always add values to the array. We can always update values to the array. We can add as many values as we want to the array. And there's no limits. Okay, and we can delete values from the array whenever we want. All right, so another way, let's just say, for example, whoa. I don't know what the hell is going on. Okay, so let's just say, for example, if we wanted to add elements to an array programmatically, right? Because right now we're kind of just like hard coding all of these values, right? This is like a literal, basically, right? Let's just say we start with an empty array and we want to add values to an array. Right? At some point, we may need to add a value to an array. Let's say if someone signs up for a website, we want to add them to our array and do stuff with it. We can do this in different ways, but the most common way that you do it is using the push operator or push method. Now, the push method is a method that belongs to the array, the array prototype. Okay, it's actually called the array prototype. And we'll talk about that when we get into when we talk about prototypes in JavaScript. But just for now, just remember that push is a method that belongs to any array object. Okay, so we can say names, which is the array, dot push, and then we can go ahead and we can just push in the value. So let's just say Anson, and if we do a console.log before and after, so before we push and then after we push, you're gonna see that in the console, it's going to log an empty array, and then it's going to log an array with my name in there. So that's one way we can push values to it. And it's important to note that when you call the push method on an array, it will actually add that element to the end of the array. So if I push another name like Kelvin, and if I log it to the console, it's actually going to go at the end. So you're going to see it's going to say Anson, Kelvin. And if I do names dot push Zach, console.log names, and you're gonna see that Zach is gonna be added to the end, just like that. Pretty cool. All right. What if we wanted to add elements to the beginning of an array? We can do that using the unshift method. Okay, so it's pretty much like the inverse, not the inverse, but it's pretty much the same thing, but instead it just adds to the front. So if we wanted to add a name or an element to the front of our array, so let's say if I want to add an element in front of Anson, I can do so by saying names.unshift, and I can just say, let's add, I don't know, Tom. If we log this to the console, you're going to see Tom is now going to be in the front. It's going to be all the way in the beginning of the array. Okay? Cool. So one thing that I also need to mention is that when it comes to referencing certain values in the array, because right now we have, an array of names, right? But how do I, let's say for example, what if I wanted to access a certain name, right? A certain element inside this array? How would I do that? Right? So when it comes to arrays, remember how I mentioned earlier that arrays are indexed, right? They're indexed. They start at 0, and they go up to the length of the array minus 1 for the index. And I'll explain what that means. So in this array, we have an array of 4 elements, right? The first element is in index 0, position 0, subscript 0. That is its position. Okay, we'll call it a position, but really it's just called an index. Okay, so Tom, as you can see over here, is in position 0. Okay, let me actually zoom in because I know you guys probably can't see this. You can see Tom is in position 0. Anson is in position 1. Kelvin is in position 2. And Zach is in position 3. Some people get confused with arrays because they think that they get confused with the fact that it starts at 0. But just remember, arrays start at 0. Okay, likewise, strings also start at 0, like the character position. It all starts at 0. Okay, so it's 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay, now the length of this array is 4, but the last subscript is 3. Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that. So let's say if we wanted to access the value Tom, right? Well, we know the value. Well, we know the position. The position number, the position number that Tom is in, and it's in position 0. So if we want to reference, position 0, we can use the bracket operator, and we can go ahead and say, let's just say console.log position 0, and we say names, so the name of the array, square brackets 0, just like that, and that is going to get me the value of the element. Well, that's going to give me the elements at position 0. So if I save this and if I run, you're going to see, notice how it says position 0 Tom, just like that, very easy. And then you can probably guess, well, how do we get the value Anson? Well, Tom is at position 0, Anson is in position 1. Okay, it's in sequential order when it comes to arrays. It's all linear. Okay, so if I want to get the value Anson, we know that it's in position 1. Likewise, you can guess Kelvin is located in position 2, and to reference that, we would say names 2, and then to get the last element, we do 3. Now, the thing is with arrays is that you kind of need to know, if you wanted to access certain elements, you would actually need to know where they are in beforehand, but we're going to get to that when we go over algorithms, okay? So for now, don't worry so much about that. Now, let's just say if we wanted to get the last element of an array, but we don't know what the size of the array is. So what we can do is we can actually reference the property length. Okay, so the value right now is going to be 4. But watch what happens. Let's just say, for example, so remember the value of names.length is 4, right? Because the length of this array is 4. Now the problem is that let's say if I run this, you're going to see this as undefined. The reason why is because, well, there's nothing at position 4. And then in other languages, you would actually get an array index out of bounds exception or an error like that. But remember, arrays are dynamic in JavaScript. There's technically a bunch. You can reference like position 500, and it would just still say there might not be anything there, right? But it would just say undefined, just like that. Okay. So, but here's the thing. So, but the thing is, the names.length is the length of it is 4. So the value of this evaluates the 4. Right, but we want the last element. Now, this is actually a common issue that people face. It's actually called an off by 1 error. So since we know the length is 4, right, if we want to get the last element, we would just subtract 1, okay? and that would give us that's how you would get the last element in an array, the easiest way, without knowing the size of the array beforehand. All right, cool. And I think that pretty much just covered all that. And I guess one more example that I could go over, or we have, well, when it comes to adding elements to the array, is let's say if we wanted to add elements in between, in between two elements, right? So how would we do that? Okay, so let's just say if I wanted to add a name between Anton and Kelvin, right? We can use the function array.splice. Okay, now you can actually use splice to either add elements or delete elements at specific indices. We're going to use this to just add elements. Okay, so I'm going to add in between Anton and Kelvin. So we're going to go ahead and say names.splice. And what we need to do for the first parameter, we need to specify where we want to start adding elements. In this case, I want to add it in 0, 1. I want to add it in position 2. Okay, so remember it's going between Anton and Kelvin. If we were to add in a new value in between it, the position would be 2. So we say position 2. The next parameter is the delete count. Since we're not deleting anything, we're going to say 0. And then the next element is the element. The next parameter is the element that we want to add. So I want to add the name. What name? Sarah. Okay. And now you're going to see that Sarah is going to be added in position 2. Kelvin is going to shift over to position 3, and Zach is going to shift over to position 4. If I run, Tom, Anton, Sarah, Kelvin, Zach. Let's say if I want to add between Kelvin and Zach. The same logic follows, right? Names.splice. We want to add starting at position over here. So it's kind of like we're taking over position Zach, but then we're really just shifting Zach to the right. So this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're going to say position 4. We're not deleting anything, so specify 0. And then let's just add, I don't know, crystal, console.log, names. There you go. Crystal is added in between Kelvin and Zach, just like that. Okay, awesome. And of course, if we want to delete certain values in between, we could use splice for that as well. So I'll just show you a quick example. So let's say if I want to delete crystal, I can just specify position 4, delete 1. Okay, because that's really what that second parameter is it's just used for deleting. And you can see crystal was deleted, just like that. All right, cool. And we can also update values inside an array too. That's one thing that I need to mention as well. So we can, remember, we can reference a certain index. So let's say, for example, let's say if I want to get rid of Anson and replace it with something else. So Anson is at position 1. So we're going to say names at subscript 1. Let's just set this to Anthony. And let's also change Tom to Thomas. Now let's log the names array. And you're going to see Thomas, Anthony, Sarah, Kelvin, Zach. Just like that. Okay. And I know I mentioned this earlier that arrays can have mixed data types as well. So I mentioned that already. And another thing we can also do with arrays, and this is just one of the many things that we can do with arrays, we can actually loop through arrays. Let's say, for example, if I have an array of names, right, and I want to log every single one of them, right, instead of just doing, I mean, you can think, okay, well, can't we just do console.log names 0, names 1, names 2, names 3, names 4, names 5, right? You'd be like, okay, can't we just do that, and wouldn't that work? And again, it would go back to the whole question that I asked in the video talking about loops. You could, right? Now, but there's going to be some issues. You might not know how many elements are in that array, and you might not know when to stop. Okay, and obviously it's just going to be very tedious. So we can use loops to solve that issue. So we're going to use a loop structure. So we're going to say for, we're going to create our variable I equals 0. Because we're going to start at 0, remember, because arrays start at 0, so it makes sense to have our initial variable I to start at 0. Okay, let's do I less than. So our condition is going to be I less than names.length, because that basically tells us how many times we're going to loop through. We want to loop all the way until the end of the loop. And how do we know when we're at the end of we want to loop all the way until we're at the end of the array. And how do we know when we're at the end of the array? Well, we're basically going to increment I after every single iteration, and we're going to check if I is less than names.length, right? And it's not going to exceed names.length, because if it does, we're going to exit the loop. And names.length is the total amount of elements in that array. Okay, so we have our loop, we have our loop body, and the question is, how do we actually log the names to the console? Well, the value of I is 0. Okay, and 0, remember, is the first position of any array. Okay, any populated array. So what we want to do is we want to reference names, and we're going to pass in I, okay, and the value of I currently on the first iteration is 0. So that's going to log Tom. Okay, once we're done with that, it's going to go back up. It's going to increment by 1. Okay, so I becomes 1. 1 is less than names.length, right? Names.length is 5. 1 is less than 5. So then it's going to do console.log names at subscript 1 at position 1, and the value of that is Anson. Okay, then it's going to do the same thing again. Position 2, the value of that is Sarah, 3 and 4. Okay, so let's run this code real quick, and let's just see what happens. So you can see Thomas, Anthony, Sarah, Kelvin, and Zach. And that's how you would iterate through an array, and that's how you would, print all the names or elements inside an array. Okay, so yeah, I hope all of that made some sense. I know it could, be a little bit difficult to wrap your head around, but arrays are awesome. They're very useful in many, many, many applications. You're always going to use arrays no matter what. I mean, there might be some situations where you might want to use another data structure over a different one, but we're not going to talk about that in this video. That's going to be for our data structures and algorithms course. So yeah, I guess that's pretty much it for arrays. So I will see you guys in my next video. Peace.